Thanks, Greg. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Aim Sin Peng. I'm an associate professor here in the discipline of government and international relations. Part of the reason why University of Sydney is such a great place to study is actually the Sydney Southeast Asia Center. And I'm really excited to be part of the Politics in Action, which we've been running for quite several years now successfully. And thank you so much for joining us today. So the format of our panels and speaker will be each country speaker will get 20 minutes presentation and 10 minutes Q&A from you. I'll be briefly introducing the three speakers that are coming on the first panel, and then I'll pass it on to the next moderator for the second panel. So for the first panel, we have speakers that will be speaking on Vietnam, Thailand, and the Philippines. For Vietnam, we have former Australian ambassador to Vietnam, Andrew Goledzinowski, who has had a distinguished diplomatic career, serving as Australian ambassador to Vietnam, High Commissioner to Malaysia, ambassador for people smuggling and human trafficking issues, and ambassador deputy PR to United Nations. He was also posted to Geneva, Port Vila, Pretoria, and Wellington, and led numerous emergency deployments, such as in Ukraine, Iraq, Syria, and Fiji. Please welcome Mr. Andrew.
Well, thank you, Greg. Thank you, Anne. Thank you, SSEAC. Good morning, everyone. Unlike most of the other presenters who will have very professional slide decks, I only have one image to show you, but I hope notwithstanding that, you will agree with me by the end of my presentation that Vietnam is currently the most interesting country in Asia. A lot of you know Vietnam quite well. You know a lot about the history, but let me just focus on 3 points in Vietnam's history that I think are particularly important. The first is the moment more than 1,000 years ago when Vietnam won its independence from its neighbor China, because all of the history of Vietnam over the last millennium has been a story of Vietnam's struggle to retain that independence. The second point in history that I want to reference is a moment in 1986 when, according to legend, the Politburo was meeting in a room and the lights went out. And no one said anything for about a minute until one voice sounded out to say, "We cannot continue like this." And that was the moment when Doi Moi began, the process of economic reform and renovation, which really brought modern Vietnam economy into being. And the third important historical point I want to mention is in August last year when To Lam, who was then the president of Vietnam, ascended to the position of General Secretary of the Communist Party. And I do have an image of To Lam that I can put up. Oh, I do it here, do I? This button? Nope. Ah, there it is. Okay. He became General Secretary of the Communist Party, and most of what I want to talk about is his process then of really bringing about a total change to Vietnam's economic, social, and political outlook. Let me start by talking a bit about foreign policy. I'm a foreign policy person, and I'm someone who is a great admirer of Vietnam's foreign policy. Amongst practitioners, it is considered to be one of the most professional foreign services and one of the most effective in pursuing Vietnam's strategic and geographic objectives, remembering that Vietnam has had an incredibly difficult history and has an incredibly difficult place in geography as well. As a result of that, Vietnam has these 4 no policies. The 4 no's are no alliances, no foreign basing, no siding with one country against another, and no use of or threat of use of force in foreign policy. And that really is informed both by Vietnam's history, but also, as I said, by its geography. If it didn't have those 4 no's and a very deeply ingrained tradition of neutrality, it would be liable to be embraced by its communist neighbor and fraternal partner, China, which is something that Vietnam will never allow. But what has changed recently is Vietnam has decided to more actively engage in diplomacy, to diversify its relationships. So when I arrived in Vietnam as ambassador, Vietnam only had 3 partners at the highest level of diplomacy, what we call the comprehensive strategic partnership level. And those 3 were Russia, China, and India. While I was in Vietnam, they added to that list Australia, Japan, Korea, and the United States. And in the few months since I've left Vietnam, they've also added Singapore, Thailand, and I think Indonesia. So this is an active process of diversifying its diplomatic connections to strengthen its relationships, its opportunities, and to provide it with greater leverage. Vietnam has always been very active in its own interests, particularly in terms of defending its borders and its maritime interests. But it hasn't been terribly active within ASEAN or within the broader international environment. It's an interesting point that Vietnam bid to hold the position of regional head of the World Health Organization and failed to get elected to that position. If it had gotten that position, it would have been the most senior UN appointment any Vietnamese has ever held. Quite remarkable, right? But this is now changing. And I think this is also reflected in the way the fact that Vietnam is now looking to create its own independent foreign policy think tank. It's looking to extend its foreign policy reach around the world in various ways. And it sees Australia as an important element in that process. The more important point, I guess, with To Lam is his economic ambitions. Vietnam has done well. Since the beginning of Doi Moi, Vietnam's GDP has grown by 2,000%. Pretty impressive. Under the previous regimes, they were happy with about a 6 to 7% economic growth per year. The way I thought of it was like driving down the road, 60 kilometers an hour was good enough. And the party wanted to keep both hands on the steering wheel. What To Lam has now proposed is that the party should get into the back seat and should allow the country to go at 120 kilometers an hour, 12% growth. He's formally committed to double-digit growth, which no other previous general secretary has ever done. Why is that important? Well, it's important because Vietnam's success until now will not guarantee success for the next period. Its success was built on large-scale, relatively low-value manufacturing, taking advantage of cheap land and cheap labor. Well, the land is now gone, and the rural surplus of labor has already been absorbed into the cities and into the modern economy. So that is now changing. Vietnam is in danger of falling into the classic middle-income trap where it fails to progress to the high-value manufacturing, but prices itself out of the lower-value manufacturing, which currently is the basis of its economy. To Lam understands that. So for him, making this jump is important, and particularly it has to happen before Vietnam falls into the demographic trap that North Asia now is in. Japan and Korea have stopped growing, but they're already rich. China has also stopped growing, and it's not yet rich. Vietnam still has that opportunity. So for Vietnam, that means technological change. It means being able to attract the best high-tech industries, not just as a China plus one strategy, but as a recognition of Vietnam's value in itself. And those of you who have been there know that there is no country in the world where the people are more enterprising, more intelligent, more hardworking, more focused than in Vietnam. So it really has a great deal to offer the world. But making that transition is tricky. So what To Lam has proposed is recently they've announced a new policy where all investor inquiries and applications will be answered within 2 weeks rather than 2 months or 2 years, which was the case before. He has curbed some of the excesses of the blazing furnace policy of anti-corruption, which had put fear into all the bureaucrats so that, in fact, no decisions were being taken. He has abolished, I think it's 5 ministries by combining them with other ministries, has deleted an entire layer of bureaucracy in the district administrators, and is reducing the number of provinces from 63 to 44 or 46, something like that. In the process, he will be eliminating 100,000 bureaucrats and then taking that saved salary income and paying the existing bureaucrats more. All these are really significant changes, not just to the way in which government manages business, but in the political and economic culture of the country. But it's essential, and it's something which I think will have a great deal of support from the Vietnamese people. When Tholam first announced some of these changes at a meeting of the Central Committee, within a very short time, I went out with a tweet, and those of you who followed me as ambassador would have seen it, declaring that that speech was the most important delivered in Vietnam in at least 2 generations. A lot of my ambassadorial colleagues were taken aback that I would be making a call as big as that, as quickly as that. But my judgment was, yes, the changes is important, is critically important for Vietnam, and he should be encouraged and supported in taking that brave step. And I think the recent history has suggested that others are now kind of also recognizing the importance of what Tholam is attempting to achieve. I will tell you the story of this front page of The Economist, because it's a bit interesting. I know the Economist team in Singapore, and they approached me at one point saying they want to go to Vietnam and write a big story about this important transition that is underway, but they're not getting a lot of traction with the Vietnamese system. So I weighed in to the extent that I could with my contacts and said, look, I to the extent that you think I have a good call on these things, I trust the Economist team will write an overall positive piece. They're not looking to do a hit job on Vietnam. They want genuinely to explain what's happening, and it's in Vietnam's interest that this message should get out. Well, they were allowed in. They did, I think it's 4 articles in this particular edition, which is 2 weeks ago, and I thought it was a very good piece. Vietnam's response was to ban The Economist in Vietnam. And I got this call from Aaron Connolly saying, what went wrong? And what went wrong was not the articles themselves, it was the image. The idea of manipulating the Vietnamese flag in this way is unacceptable. And secondly, there's a great tradition, as there is in much of Southeast Asia, of leaders being modest, not putting themselves on the front cover of things in that way. And this would have been seen by Tholam's enemies, and of course every leader has enemies, as a way of attacking him. So the easiest solution was to ban The Economist, at least this edition. Which is an interesting story, right? Because even The Economist's Asia team got this wrong, and it just shows you how cultural literacy and understanding what does or does not fly in another country is something which is, we are always learning and always making mistakes. So I thought that was an interesting snippet. I think I'm still well under time, and I could keep talking, I really could. But I'd be much more interested in hearing questions and responding to them. I think that's always the best part of any presentation. So I would invite people, I think Lydia has the roving microphone. If anybody would like to make an observation or ask a question, please go ahead. While we're looking for questioners, let me just say, on the bilateral side of things, our relationship with Vietnam now is as good as it has ever been. When I was paying my farewell calls, the Prime Minister of Vietnam had tears in his eyes, and there wasn't a dry eye in the house, literally. There's a great deal of affection and warmth for Australia. There's an understanding that Australia is uniquely placed to help partner Vietnam in terms of its future progress in many ways, but particularly through our education system and our universities, our high-tech businesses, and our ability to work with them across a lot of the contemporary challenges, whether it's agri-tech, fintech, green energy transition, etc. Vietnam at the moment, and I'm sure we'll come to this later, but is enormously exposed by the changes in US policy. Because Vietnam, their biggest export destination is the United States. Fully 30% of all their exports go to the US. And their biggest import partner is China, which is the exact opposite of what Australia has. So it's an interesting time for Vietnam, a time of enormous opportunity and enormous challenge. But my personal view is never bet against Vietnam, because Vietnam may take longer than expected, but it always finds a way. Okay, questions?
Yeah. Thank you, Andrew. Adrian Vickers, University of Sydney.
Yes.
Yeah, that was a good kind of overall picture, but I'm wondering what things look like on the ground in terms of differences between central control and sort of the relative autonomy of region. And from my very limited experience of working in Vietnam, you get a different story from Hanoi than you get on the ground in Hue. So how does that balance out with the aspirations to central control versus the potential realities?
Well, that's a good point. I don't think there's any change to the decentralization philosophy. The view in Vietnam, as it is elsewhere, is that the best government is the one that's closest to the people. So they will continue to empower the provinces. But what they will do is amalgamate provinces to make them actually more efficient and stronger. The difficulty with 63 provinces in a country the size of Vietnam, which is smaller than Papua New Guinea, is that big infrastructure projects like irrigation systems, ring roads, etc., they can't be built because it takes too many different bureaucracies to align. And the World Bank, they did a calculation. One major project that they undertook took 115 separate signatures to get it through. And they said they simply can't go down that track again. So I think it's consistent with decentralization and this sort of like collective leadership and consensus style of politics in Vietnam, but it'll be making it more efficient. I think that's his objective.
So thanks, Andrew. And it's great, really, a picture that you're painting of the current state in Vietnam. But one particular thing that Tall Arm also has been big about is this technological leap, in a sense of sort of moving Vietnam from a kind of traditional manufacturing base to much more high tech. And this is not necessarily new. I've heard this in Vietnam for many years, even in the context of agriculture. They've been talking about something called Agriculture 4.0 for many, many years. But then I just want to sort of get your sense of what is the actual potential. So this high tech in sort of sectors, whether it be in IT or in advanced manufacturing or in services, really require, it's really probably a synonym for a knowledge economy, right? So you need very highly skilled people, high education and high research sort of capacity and research institutions. And while Vietnam has gone, has increased that dramatically over the last 20, 30 years, thanks partly to people who come here and study and go back and so on. Sorry. My sense is they're not still there yet with that level that is required for that kind of
They're not there yet.
High tech. And so how do you see they will get there?
Well, with help. I said this to the university executive. There are three obstacles to Vietnam in particular reaching its objectives, and its objective is to become a high-income developed economy by 2045. The three obstacles are infrastructure, technology, and human resource development. And the first two they can manage. Infrastructure, you can buy infrastructure, and they're busy now planning sort of high-speed rail, etc. Technology will come when businesses see Vietnam as being a better place to invest than, for example, Korea or the Philippines or China. human resource development's the tough one, because although the Vietnamese are obsessed in that Confucian way with education, they don't have the systems there to really deliver the sort of experts that they need. And we're seeing that. We're seeing businesses scaling up beyond their capacity to manage the growth because they don't have the skilled people. Government is hoovering up too many skilled people with degrees. That's going to change. But they are looking to countries, when I say like Australia, I mean particularly Australia, to partner with them in basically this education revolution which is needed. And it has to happen in a different way than it has in the past. And that is a huge challenge, and one that I think Australia is uniquely well placed to meet if we have the willingness to do that.
Hi, Andrew. My name is Helen. I am a senior public servant with postings in Indonesia and most recently China. I just joined the Sydney University's Vietnam Institute and Centre in China. So I think a great segue to your last point about education. Where do you see the opportunities for Sydney University in particular with its newly established Vietnam Institute, currently with a huge focus on health and clinical trials collaboration? How can you see the opportunities there for Sydney University to foster that kind of deepening partnership in education and more broadly, the people-to-people links?
Well, thank you, Helen. That's exactly the sort of point that we were making to the university executive, is this new model of collaboration and partnership. If we want to engage with Southeast Asia, we have to engage in Southeast Asia. And it won't just be teaching, it should be collaboration around research, and it should be with government, and it should be with industry. And that's why the Sydney Vietnam Institute is such a good model. And the big obstacle to these things is summoning the courage to take the risk to embark on these projects, because a project like that was always destined to succeed, in my view. It's easy to say that now, but when you put the right leaders in place, and Sydney University has done that, and you have the right sort of structure and the right collaborators, the process unfolds in the way it should. And I think that's the future. And in particular, I think bringing in the private sector, whether it be semiconductors, whether it be biotech, whether it be fintech, whether it be agri-tech, I think there's a wall of money out there ready to come into Vietnam. There is so much, not hot money, but it's money that has been unallocated, which increasingly won't be going to China and may not be going to the United States, and Europe doesn't look like a great bet either. Southeast Asia is going to be the growth engine for the next decade. And that's where we need to build these collaborations, innovative partnerships around particular needs where universities have unique roles to play. Exactly how it'll work, we won't know until we start. The example I gave to the illustration I gave to the university executive was, it's like crossing the road in Hanoi. You can't plan it from the curb. You have to step out and you will get to the other side of the street, but you won't know how until you start. Yes, sir.
Hello, Andrew. My name's Van. Unfortunately, I missed the beginning of your lecture because I couldn't find the building. But but just wanted to ask a question. So I'm of Vietnamese background, one of those children of the 70s and 80s who came over here after the war. And so I guess my question is, I was brought up by parents and family members to say not to ever trust the communist government in Vietnam. That's not my, I guess, thoughts now, because we're a different generation. But I guess my question would be, do you see the new generation of, I guess, overseas Vietnamese being a bit more trustworthy of the government there and the politics, or is it still, do you still think that there's that kind of dichotomy between, the overseas Vietnamese and the current government in Vietnam?
Thank you for your question. I know exactly where you're coming from because my father couldn't return to Poland for a long time because of the communist regime. And he never forgave the communist regime in Poland for taking those years from him. So I know exactly that feeling. But to answer your question, first of all, the government in Hanoi is very keen on reconciliation with the diaspora, and Carl Thayer has written recently about that, and I think they're sincere. And I think the diaspora, especially your generation and younger ones, are going back to Vietnam. So yesterday I had a meeting with the leaders of a company here in Australia, led by Vietnamese Australians, and I think they may be the next unicorn. I mean, really interesting, and they're working a lot with Vietnam. And when I go to Vietnam, when I was in Vietnam, there were so many young Australian Vietnamese people like Luc Nguyen, the celebrity chef, and others who have gone back and have been very successful. And I said again to the university executive, that's our superpower. Australia's superpower and our advantage over Europe and everybody else is we have these diasporas who speak both languages, not just literally, but culturally, who wouldn't make a mistake like The Economist made. I think that is the future, and that I think I would like to see in universities, in the private sector and elsewhere, that young Vietnamese should be the ones who lead our engagement with Vietnam. We have time for maybe one more question, if it's a short one.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. My question is with the backseat analogy, the Communist Party. I don't see a lot of indications of the Communist Party willing to take a backseat. I see them very much still at the forefront. So I guess I was curious as to what sort of indications you've seen or any evidence for that idea of them taking a backseat in developments in Vietnam.
Right. I didn't explain my analogy well enough. I meant in terms of driving the economy. So what they need to do is let the private sector drive the economy, and they give directions from the backseat. And that's different from now, because at the moment, more than 50% of the economy is in the hands of government and state-owned enterprises. And the party is used to micromanaging the way in which economics works. That is not the Australian model. We regulate from the back seat and let the private sector make their own decisions. And that is the future for Vietnam, if Vietnam is to make the transition that it hopes to make. And whether that is successful or not, well, we'll have to wait and see. But as I said, I don't think it's wise to bet against Vietnam, and I think they will succeed. That's it. Thank you very much, everyone.